Ahoy! We are taking a look at the winners and the losers of the Season 10 patch when it comes to artifacts. Now, to be clear here, this is not a tier list, and this is not saying that any artifact that I mentioned in a specific segment is best in slot now or is worst in slot, but I'm talking about which ones benefited from this patch a lot versus which ones didn't really benefit or lost some good perks with the changes. This will not just focus on the pure perks on the items, but also on the overall effectiveness in the meta. The first winner is Blooddrinker. It has its negative downsides reduced somewhat, and it's also something that is very, very useful for Catacombs specifically, and many other types of solo content that you might be doing at the moment. Really, everything you want is there for this artifact right now. It is one of the most sought after ones, and I think it'll stay in this place for a while, and it was already good before. Lifetaker is also a massive winner. You wouldn't necessarily expect it, but the damage this can put out both in PvP and PvE now seems pretty insane. I'd like to thank Roger for pointing this out to me in the context of PvE specifically as well. And that is partially at least because of the scaling. It scales 75% with Dex and 75% with Int, which makes it scale better than most regular Void Gauntlets that don't really work that well with the focus scaling. So this is something to look out for. This is something I think we'll see a lot more of, and it might potentially get a bit of a nerf depending on how things go. Another absolutely insane artifact in this season is Inferno. You'll see this being used with a lot of melee builds. It is not so much about the attribute scaling change, because you're not really going to use it with a 50-50 scaling anyway. However, it is very beneficial in a meta where we're seeing very bursty builds in the first place. You can go very damage focused and just add this on top of that. And additionally, in context of this scaling fix, they also finally fixed the dot scaling of Inferno when scaling with strength, or rather, when scaling with both now. Previously, if you scaled it with strength, the dots would basically do almost no damage, whereas now they will do the normal amount, and that makes it hit a fair bit harder as well, even though if you're using it as an offhand, you're still gonna get the vast majority of your damage out of your main hand. But it also is a good tool to finish people off. Boltcaster is extremely strong this season, and I cannot fully tell you why. I don't know if there's something happening behind the scenes with the scaling here that makes it hit significantly harder. It is maybe also partially the changed gear, but then many people are still running old gear and you're still getting hit really hard. There are some people saying that there is a bug happening here with Boltcaster specifically, because sometimes the damage just seems a bit too much. We don't know yet for sure. I haven't fully figured it out, but either way, Boltcaster is extremely strong right now, does a lot of damage, a lot of burst, and feels very effective. Old Crown got a pretty massive buff along with a nerf to the attributes, but even this little bit of extra attributes, this +6, is enough to give you one extra capstone. If you're, for example, running 350 and 200, then you can run another 25 somewhere, which is quite beneficial, quite useful for certain builds. And along with that, all of the gems in this are now swappable. You can't put the exact same gem into every single one, but you can put different ones, you can rune glass them, and as such you can get very significant benefits from this alone. Vengeance passive overhaul is very strong. The outgoing healing is increased by 25% when not affected by any life staff heal over time effects. That is just a very nice bonus to have. And this doesn't have a gem socket, which would normally be a significant downside for damage-focused artifacts, but for Lifestaff specifically, the increase from the socket compared to some other perks isn't that insane. It's still good, but it's not something where you're quite as reliant on it, and there are other options to work around that, or that are more beneficial in some situations, like, for example, Savior. So not having a gem slot here isn't a massive issue. If you made it this far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you enjoyed the video and you want to have more info videos like this. Also, I've been streaming a bit more again lately, twitch.tv/DukeSloth, if you want to check that out. Now, Koya's knee guards are one of those items that is getting a lot of interest at the moment. It's being talked about a lot more on the higher levels of play. Mikro talked about it recently as well. And this one is just interesting insofar that you get pretty significant damage reduction from it from all ranged attacks now, 13%, and other mitigation perks have been nerfed a fair bit, so Koya's is kind of holding up better in comparison. Also has some okay perks on there, or good perk slots on there, so this could be something we'd see a lot more of, especially if bows keep hitting as hard as they do and muskets as well. Freedom is a very interesting artifact now because the Freedom perk on items now scales up to 15%. So if you have a full set of Freedom, you can have 95% Freedom with this artifact included. By the way, the Freedom perk has a stack max of 5, so you do need this artifact to get that high. You can't just stack 6 or 7 with more defensive slots. Creed Boots is a very interesting option. I've been running this lately, and the damage output that you can get in some situations is insane. It's extremely difficult to trade into someone who's hit you with ambush. And this artifact is a risky one. I wouldn't recommend this for beginner players, since you don't have a gem slot on there, so you're sacrificing some defense. However, the passive can make it worth it if your playstyle affords that. Very glass cannon, very risky for the most part, but can be very, very nice. Contagious Plague is brand new, so technically it didn't really improve, but it's just very well performing right off the bat. A very strong passive with the pull, extremely annoying to play against, so I would say this is a bit of a winner as well. I want to mention Justice here, but it's a bit of a weird one, because Justice is only really a winner because a lot of other jewelry pieces, or artifacts specifically, aren't that great anymore. And Justice comes with Refreshment on it and a gem slot, so it has the base perks that you want on an earring now, and until you find a better random roll, I think it is a nice option to have, even though the passive itself isn't that great, so a minor winner maybe. I want to mention Jin head wrap as a bit of a bonus here. It hasn't really changed, but it is a winner insofar that it is just doing well. It was doing well before the patch with the Vigor and Invigorated stacking, and it's even easier now to do that. So arguably also a small winner, but generally it's just as good as before and probably useful in a lot of ways in this meta. Also, I think Aconite is a small winner, and that's specifically because the passive is one that could be used for rapiers now, same way that you can use Inferno, whereas other options like Finisher, for example, are significantly worse than before for evade builds, so it has more of a place in PvE, I suppose. The next group of artifacts here is the up in the air section, where I'm not entirely sure yet because they benefit in some ways and then benefit less in others, I guess. So I'm not decided on where to place them yet, and I think Nimble Coat is a very good example of that. So Nimble Coat is technically one of the nicer options to get CDR now, and CDR is harder to get. So for example, for healers, I think this is a great option. At the same time, for PvE, there's a lot of debate of, for example, winged shoes potentially outclassing it in terms of performance, and also generally if the value of that amount of refreshing is useful in specific situations, because it depends a lot on the build, and also it depends a lot on the meta in general, which weapons will be favorable. So I think it's a difficult one. I'm leaning towards this being probably a winner, but I don't know for sure yet. With Featherweight, it's a bit the other way around, because if you get staggered while wearing it now, you get a 7% slow for 3 seconds. But on the other hand, I have seen people use Featherweight. I knew that they were using Featherweight, and trying to kill a healer with Featherweight is still extremely difficult, no matter what. So you don't really notice that slow that much in many situations. It is just 7%, and the damage reduction in return is still very noticeable. As such, I think some people are writing this off very quickly. I am not sure if we really should write Featherweight off, or if this is just a kind of a shift in making it not quite as dominant. Unyielding is an interesting one, because a lot of other defensive artifacts have more downsides now, have nerfs now, and we are seeing more and more crit-focused builds. So far this hasn't really been talked about much, but I could absolutely see us moving more towards a meta where certain builds will utilize Unyielding just to reduce the damage taken, if crit happens to be more and more prominent, or especially if Vicious in builds becomes more and more prominent, as we are currently seeing. The Unmoved, very, very strong in PvE for tanking, and in my opinion, generally slept on a lot, especially with the now buffed passive. So in that regard, definitely a winner. However, the problem is that with Freedom Pants being so strong and so effective, I feel like Unmoved has a bit less of a place. If I'm choosing between just not being displaced or being almost immune to a lot of types of CC, I kind of am leaning more towards Freedom in some situations, But on the other hand, the disruption caused by displacements and staggers can be really annoying. So I think Unmoved could have its place. We'll see how things develop here. If people start leaning more towards it, it definitely has more potential with Void Darkblade kind of dropping out a bit. We'll get to that later. But not entirely decided where this will end up. I will keep testing it though. Not entirely sure about attuned leather pants either. I feel like in terms of reaching a capstone, you're probably gonna go for Old Crown a lot of the time and not necessarily for attuned leather pants because you get more benefits out of it. But there has always kind of been a place for just having raw extra stats, and I'm not quite sure where this will end up, or if it will also be used in different ways in light builds as a more defensive tool, and maybe in PvP even. This is something I cannot fully determine yet, and I will wait out and see what happens. Tumbler Feebreps got some significant nerfs to the Empower and Fortify. You still have the heal on it. It is on a 3 seconds cooldown. I think it's good, but I also don't know if I would still favor it in the same way. Again, comparing it to something like having Freedom Pants at this point, I think you'd have to have a very specific playstyle where you're really consistently dodging attacks in the right moment to get enough effectiveness out of this now, since the benefit that you're getting in general is a fair bit smaller. But I'm still leaning towards this being one of the stronger artifacts. Grace is very interesting. It got an additional buff on top of the 15% movement speed, where while haste is active, your abilities deal 8% more damage. I think this has potential. 8% isn't crazy high, but you can also further amplify this with other ability damage increases. There are quite a few of those that you can get on other pieces, and maybe that will be what sends it into the right place. So also one that needs more testing. I really like this approach, something different for Greatsword that's not heavy attacks for once, but we'll see how well it actually does. Phoenix is interesting because as an amulet it doesn't have the multiple stacking protections, which most playstyles are looking for right now, so in that regard it's not really good. However, with the very aggressive builds that we're seeing coming out that are more and more burst focused and closer and closer to one-shot really, you gotta wonder if there's a place for Phoenix regardless, where if you don't get hit you don't have to worry about defenses in the first place, and then if you end up getting hit in the right moment, Phoenix allows you to just come back and kill that person anyway. So once again, one of those things where you need to just test around with it, see where the meta goes, but I see some potential here since I think we are seeing more true assassin builds. This could get even further amplified if daggers turn out to be very bursty as well. Plague Herald got a nerf this season that applies more disease to yourself when you use it, but on the other hand it synergizes quite well with Blooddrinker now, so there's a potential benefit in that. And also, depending on how the meta will go, we have more reductions to various debuffs, or potentially this will be one of the ways that we utilize disease still. It is, once again, more up in the air. Not entirely sure where to place it yet, but I think this is one to keep an eye on at least. There are obviously more artifacts that I will not mention here in this middling category because they haven't really changed that much, or I haven't looked into them enough, but I wanted to mention these ones, and now we're moving on to the ones that I think lost this patch. Finisher is a very good example of what I mean by that. Finisher is not a bad artifact. It is not by any means useless. It is very effective for bleed builds that consistently apply their own bleeds, and if you're running a bleed rapier, you are probably going to be running Finisher still. However, since the passive now only works with your own bleeds, it says here, your bleeds applied by you rather than other people's as well, this does not work as well anymore for evade rapiers, and I think that is a very good thing because it was just too ever-present. It wasn't best in slot, but it was so close to best in slot that it was hardly worth crafting anything else. Now, there are most certainly better options for evade rapiers with an Inferno offhand, with an Aconite offhand, whereas Finisher will probably have a relatively inconsistent uptime because you rely on that flurry bleed, and if another rapier in a raid, for example, finishes that, then it's gone. So, as such, Finisher is still very good, but definitely lost some of the benefits in this patch for specific playstyles. Serenity, on the other hand, just lost. Transient Strikes and Transient Crits is now something that can just be randomly rolled on any greatsword that you find in the wild, and along with that, you can roll more perks, more beneficial perks, you can have infixes, you can have a bunch of different stuff that Serenity can't have, and Serenity doesn't have a gem socket. So Serenity's supreme rule as the best greatsword for everything, except ranged attacks apparently, is over, and I don't think I'm all too sad about it, just because it made the meta for greatswords pretty boring, and now I think we'll see more different, interesting options. It's possible that Serenity will still find use cases though. Maybe, for example, people will still utilize the defense stance part in some way. The Abyss lost mainly because Inferno does the same thing better now. The previous Abyss plus Firestaff build is just replaced by Great Axe plus Inferno instead, and it is a whole lot more effective in the ways of the melee player, because you get that extra melee damage, whereas the whole Abyss passive is a lot more conditional and a lot more complicated. And on top of that, Abyss now has 50% dual scaling, or rather 75%, 75% for strength and int, which makes it more difficult to combine it with other weapons and get ideal scalings, whereas beforehand you could just go full int and get a lot of damage out of that. And as such, of all the split stats, this seems to be the only one that hasn't really benefited that much from this patch for a very, very long time, and it is interesting to occasionally shake things up a little bit. Void Darkblade went from the all-rounder for heavy and medium to a much more specialized limited artifact. With the equip weight being increased, your armor value in medium isn't going up nearly as much in comparison. I don't know what the new percentage is exactly. I think it was around 12% or something. Would have to check that, but either way, it is lower than before, so you probably are looking for other options in medium just because they are more appealing in general now, especially again freedom with the extra freedom perks and all that. And at the same time, for heavy, if you're going as a tank, you probably don't really want 8% increased block damage. I don't think most tanks are particularly interested in that. So it really just ends up being heavy bruisers that might be interested in this, and there aren't that many heavy bruisers out there. Unc just might be almost dead. I can't really think of any use cases where I would want this over having triple protection amulets, other than I just don't have one yet and I'm still waiting to get one. So yeah, if somebody can think of a use case for this to really be good enough still, let me know. I feel like the extra healing is just not enough to justify the loss of so many stacked protections that other amulets give you now. So unless they change that, unless they nerf that, I feel like there's very, very little reason to run Ankh. But maybe I'm just biased here, maybe I just prefer protections. Generally, I don't think this is something I would be looking for. Endless Thirst was a staple in many, many builds, and I think it will fall somewhat out of favor, so it's definitely losing this patch. By how much exactly, I can't say, but the main reason for that is that it comes with Empowering Toast and Fortifying Toast, but no Refreshing. And in my opinion, with that new Refreshment 2, it's kind of mandatory to have that in most builds because you're not getting much Refreshing in other places, and cooldowns are long, so you want to reduce them if you can. I think the benefit of just having that extra cooldown reduction is too big to sacrifice just to get a little bit more potion healing in the vast majority of situations. Again, obviously, subjective perspective here, but I think in terms of perks, there are many other earrings that I would prefer at this point. You also can't slot regenerating on it anymore, which I think you were able to use, so that's another little loss there. I'm going to show you the wall here, but this stands in for pretty much every shield artifact, because there are mechanics with the shields at the moment where your defensive perks, your protection perks on shields apply to you even while you're using another weapon, which I think is a balance issue in itself, but because of that, it's not really worth using any shield that doesn't have those protections, and that goes for pretty much any shields that I'm aware of in terms of artifacts. As such, I don't really see where they'd be utilized much unless they are fixing the perks. Crescent Wave, as weird as the wording on all these changes was, I think is one of the losers of this patch. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I'm seeing a lot less of it than before the patch, for sure. Less and less people are using it. I think it's partially because of the lack of a gem socket, which takes away a fair bit of the damage, and then also, obviously, some nerfs to the wave damage along with that. I think there is probably still a place for it It's just not going to be this oppressive crescent wave spam everywhere. Incinerating Hatchet just came out, but I really don't know what's up with it. I don't know what the idea with these perks is. The fact that you have, for example, Mortal Aggression and Disdain Infliction on there, which are both not really good perks, and it's lacking a gem socket as well, along with the passive being fun, but also not like super overwhelming. It's a cool concept, but I don't see why you'd want to use it over Freya's Francisca if you're going for a Thorn Hatchet build in any situation, really, as much as the passive sounds fun. Again, this is not a tier list. There are many artifacts that I haven't mentioned here. These are just the ones that I think are doing either better or worse this patch, or where I'm not sure yet. And in the future, I might do a full tier list if you guys want that. Generally not a fan of tier lists like this, but if it's something you highly request, I might consider it. If you enjoyed this overview and you want to see more like this, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Feel free to stop by on Twitch, links down in the description. And if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon and get early trading tips in return. Thanks to all of my patrons who I do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Sloth